The night 200 wolves watched me burn a throne, not a single one tried to stop me. But that moment, the fire, the silence, the crown turning to ash on carved stone, didn't happen the way anyone expected. Least of all me. It started 6 nights earlier, with a door I didn't knock on, a scene I wasn't meant to witness, and a silence afterward so total it rewrote every molecule of who I thought I was. My name is Tova Rennick. I was born in the Frost Hollow Pack, high in the Cairnridge Mountains, where winter lasts 9 months and the wolves who survive it don't bother with softness. My mother raised me alone after my father vanished on a border patrol when I was 11. No body recovered. No answers. The Pack Council called it a territorial dispute with a neighboring faction. My mother accepted their explanation because the alternative, that someone had specifically hunted a Frost Hollow border wolf with no rank and no enemies, was worse than not knowing. I didn't accept it. But at 11, no one asks you what you believe. His patrol coat hung on the back of our cabin door for 3 years, until I packed it into a cedar chest because seeing it every morning had become its own quiet wound. I was 23 when the treaty arrived. Alpha King Dale Korath of the Embervine Pack, ruler of the largest territory in the northern provinces, commander of a military force that made other alphas speak his name carefully, needed a political mate, not a love match, a symbol, a Luna from an allied pack whose presence beside him would cement a territorial agreement protecting Frost Hollow from the Stone Ridge faction. Brenna Hale, Frost Hollow's alpha, told me the truth without softening it. Without this alliance, Stone Ridge would absorb our territory within 18 months. Our hunters, families, elders, folded into a pack that treated conquered wolves like livestock. I won't order you, Brenna said. But 86 families sleep safely tonight because our borders hold. I'll go, I said, not because I was brave, because the weight of 86 families was heavier than my fear. Because sometimes love for your people looks like walking into a stranger's keep with one bag and a dress borrowed from your mother's closet. Sable Marin traveled with me. She'd been my closest friend since we were 11, the year my father disappeared, and she showed up at our cabin every morning for 6 months without being asked. She'd braid my hair while my mother slept and talk about anything except the empty coat on the door. On the hard days, the ones where I woke up and reached for a presence that wasn't there, Sable would sit on the edge of my bed and press her forehead against mine and say nothing until the silence stopped hurting. The night before we left Frost Hollow, she sat behind me on my mother's bed and worked my hair into a crown braid. "You're going to walk into that fortress," she said, "and they're going to realize they got more than they bargained for." I leaned back into her hands, memorized the steadiness of them. I would need that memory later, the way you need a photograph of a house that no longer stands, to remember what was real before the fire. The Embervane Keep rose from the base of Mount Varath like a geological event. Black stone walls threaded with veins of raw iron ore that glowed faintly in certain light, giving the structure the appearance of a living thing with molten blood beneath its skin. Dale Korath met me in the receiving hall, taller than expected, dark hair pushed back from a face that belonged on currency. His eyes were the deep brown of river stones, steady, unreadable, holding more information than they released. When he took my hand, his grip was precisely calibrated, firm enough for authority, gentle enough to acknowledge the cost of what I'd done by coming here. "Welcome to Embervine, Tova." My name in his voice sounded rehearsed, practiced, like he'd said it aloud to himself before I arrived. For 6 days, I learned the keep's rhythms. Morning council sessions, afternoon training rotations, evening meals at a table long enough for 40, where I sat beside him in a chair that felt borrowed. He asked about Frost Hollow, the mountain trails, the ice fishing, the way our pack marked the first thaw with a bonfire and a midnight howl that echoed through the peaks. He listened with a strategist's focus, but occasionally his expression would shift into something unguarded, and for a half second the king disappeared and the man surfaced. I noticed. I tried not to. On the 6th night, I couldn't sleep. The keep was too warm, too low, too saturated with unfamiliar scents. I walked the corridors by feel and instinct. I'd grown up reading mountain trails in the dark, and stone hallways weren't much different. I ended up on the third floor, the east corridor, where Dale's private study sat behind a door of iron-banded oak. The door was ajar. Warm light spilled through the gap like a confession offered halfway. His voice first, low, tense, threaded with a strain I hadn't heard before. Then hers. "You can't seriously go through with this, Dale. A Frost Hollow girl? She doesn't belong in this world." Her voice was smoke and crystal, entitled. The voice of a woman who considered this space hers. I pushed the door open. He stood near the window, sleeves rolled to the elbows, forearms braced against the sill. She stood close, too close, her hand resting against his shoulder, her body angled toward his in a geometry that spoke louder than words. Nesta Graven, daughter of the Ashwick delegation. Auburn hair over one shoulder, green silk dress worth more than my mother's cabin. When they turned, the scene crystallized, his proximity to her hand on his body, the late hour, the closed corridor, the door that should have been locked. Tova. He stepped back from the window. Nesta didn't step back. She examined me the way you examine a stain on clean linen. "So this is her," she said. "About me. Never to me. Here is what no one tells you about witnessing a moment like that. The pain doesn't arrive immediately. First, your eyes catalog every detail with forensic precision. The wine glass on the desk, the coat draped over the chair, the warmth of a room occupied too long by two people. Your brain processes it mechanically. Then the translation arrives, and it doesn't read as sadness. It reads as erasure. The discovery that the version of yourself you've been constructing, the one making this sacrifice meaningful, was a fiction. You aren't a partner. You're a placeholder arranged on a shelf while the real connection happened behind a door you weren't supposed to open." "Excuse me," I said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Tova, wait." "I didn't wait." Down the corridor, past the guards, past the portrait gallery, where 12 generations of Korath Alphas watched from gilt frames, through the kitchen, into the cold courtyard air where I pressed my palms flat against stone until the cold replaced the humiliation with a cleaner kind of pain. I breathed, counted to 100. By 60, the fracture had stopped spreading. By 80, I'd sealed every feeling into a compartment. By 100, I walked back inside with a spine so straight you could have used it to level a foundation. I expected a carriage at dawn, a quiet dismissal, a treaty renegotiated with different terms. Instead, the Elder Council summoned me to the Ember Chamber. The Ember Chamber was Embervine's judicial heart, an underground rotunda lit by iron braziers casting everything copper. Stone benches tiered upward. At the center, a raised platform held a single iron chair, a witness seat, lower than the Alpha's throne above it. The chamber was full. 9 elders, military commanders, visiting delegations, and on the eastern bench, Nesta Graven with her father, Alpha Dorian Ashwick of the Gravel faction. Lead Counselor Marindris rose, ancient in the geological sense, shaped by 10,000 storms and standing through every one. Her silver eyes held the authority of a woman who had buried 4 Alpha Kings and crowned 3. Tova Rennick of Frost Hollow stands as treaty-bound Luna candidate, Marin announced. Nesta Graven has formally invoked the right of contestation, claiming prior romantic bond with Alpha King Korath. My stomach dropped through the stone floor. Under Embervine law, when a Luna candidacy is contested, both claimants remain within the keep for 10 days. Both participate in governance, public ceremonies, and the proving traditions. On the final night, the pack votes. She looked at me. "Do you accept? And if I don't?" The treaty dissolves. Frost Hollow loses protection. 86 families. I accept. Would you have stayed? Trapped in a contest you never asked for, living down the hall from the woman you caught with the man you were supposed to marry, performing for a pack that hadn't decided whether you mattered? I stayed. And I made myself a promise I would survive this cycle, secure the treaty, and never let Dale Chorus see what walking into that study had actually cost me. The Luna's wing occupied the keep's upper western corridor. My quarters were sparse and clean. Nesta's, 2 doors down, had already been filled with silk curtains, crystal decanters, and fur throws, as though she'd packed for this before the contestation was announced. That detail lodged in my mind like a thorn. The proving traditions began. Multiple trials across the 10 days, each testing a different Luna capability. The first, the Hearthfire tradition, required each candidate to address the pack's families. Nesta spoke beautifully, polished references to Embervane's history, specific commanders praised by name. She'd done her research, and it showed. When my turn came, I didn't give a speech. I walked through the crowd and asked questions. I asked a border captain's mate how her daughter's leg was healing. I asked the head cook whether supply chains from the southern route had been disrupted. I asked a young mother whether the nursery had enough blankets for winter. I knew these details because I'd spent 6 days living in this fortress, eating in the kitchen, walking the village, listening when no one expected me to. The murmur afterward wasn't applause. It was recognition. That evening Dale appeared at my door. What you saw in the study doesn't require explanation. We're political partners. Your private life is your own. That's not. He stopped himself. His jaw worked. I won't insult you with excuses delivered in a hallway, but I need you to know what you saw was not what happened. I'll prove that with evidence and time, not words tonight. Good night, Alpha King. He left. His scent, cedar smoke and iron and the mineral depth of mountain rock remained. My wolf tracked his footsteps down the corridor long after the sound faded. I told myself the ache behind my ribs was exhaustion. Over the next several days, I learned 3 things. The first, Dale Korath was more complicated than I'd assessed, more burdened, and far more attentive to me than any political arrangement required. He didn't pursue me. Contestation rules prohibited it. But he found ways. He appeared at the training yard when I learned Embervane combat forms. He lingered after council sessions to walk at my pace. He left a book on mountain botany outside my door, with the pressed Cairnridge wildflower tucked inside the cover. The exact species I'd mentioned during our first week. That wildflower undid me more than any grand gesture could have. He'd sent someone to the mountains. He'd remembered a passing detail from a conversation I assumed he'd forgotten. Beneath the politics and the throne, there was a man who listened to a woman describe a flower and then moved heaven and geography to place one in her hands. The second discovery was darker. I noticed it in fragments. Conversations, Sable killed when I entered rooms. A meeting with Dorian Ashwick's advisor she called accidental. A new chain around her wrist set with a pale green stone, Greyvale's signature color, that she claimed came from a village market. That didn't exist. My father was Frost Hollow's best tracker. He'd taught me to move through terrain without disturbing a branch, to read trails in starlight, to become so still the forest forgot my presence. I never imagined using those skills to hunt my closest friend through corridors I'd memorized in days. On the 7th night of the contestation, I followed her. Sable crossed the lower courtyard, entered the old storehouse near the eastern wall. I circled to the back, found a window with a warped shutter, and pressed my ear to the gap. The Hearthfire tradition went badly. Her voice was stripped of every warmth I'd trusted. Clinical, transactional. The pack responded to Tilva more than expected. Dorian's voice, granite dragged across gravel. Then we accelerate. The Ember trial is physical. If the girl is injured beforehand, a fall on the training stairs, twisted ankle, nothing suspicious. And if she still competes, the final tradition requires the candidate to drink from the Korath chalice. A few drops of frostleaf extract and her heart stops before the toast. It mimics altitude sickness. The healers call it natural. She's a mountain wolf in lowland air. These words, spoken by a woman who had braided my hair the morning we left home, who had held my hand during the journey, who had pressed her forehead against mine on mornings when grief made it hard to breathe. She was planning my death with the casual efficiency of someone arranging a schedule. And somewhere beneath the shock a second wound opened, quieter, deeper, the woman who had shown up at my cabin every morning after my father disappeared, who had sat with me in silence until the silence stopped hurting, had been real once. All of it had been genuine once, which meant that whatever Dorian had offered her, or threatened her with, had been enough to hollow out a living bond and wear its shape like a mask. That was worse than simple betrayal. Simple betrayal is clean. This was corruption, something real made rotten from the inside. The old Tova would have burst through the door. Let emotion outrun strategy. That version had died in a steady doorway days ago. The woman at this window processed the information, filed it, and retreated in silence. The third discovery came the next morning. I'd noticed the keep's restricted archive earlier, a lower chamber behind a locked iron gate. Counselor Marin held the key and had granted access after studying me with those silver eyes, her expression unreadable as stone considering water. The archive was cold and silent, carved into the mountain's root. I found the Rennick file easily, standard genealogy tracing 8 generations in Frost Hollow. But behind it, wedged against the shelf's back panel as though someone had tried to hide it without fully committing to destruction, was a second folio, heavier, older, stamped with the Elder Council seal, labeled Rennick Matrilian, Restricted. Classification, Sauvre IGN. The chart inside didn't trace 8 generations, it traced 41. And it didn't begin in Frost Hollow, it began in a place called the Paley Reach, a location I knew only from fireside legends my father told when I was young. The Pale Reach, where the first Luna lived. The original she-wolf whose bond to the pack was so profound she could perceive every wolf's loyalty like a living web. Could strengthen bonds, sever corrupted ones, reshape the architecture of allegiance itself. The Rennick women carried a dormant ability called the Sovereign Thread, a matrilineal inheritance, structural authority over the web of bonds holding a pack together. 3 elder signatures, and Dale Korath's counter-signature. Dated 5 months ago, 2 months before the treaty reached Frost Hollow. He had known what I was before the treaty existed, before my name entered negotiation, before Brenna Hale weighed 86 families against one woman's freedom. The treaty wasn't about military alliance. It was about acquiring my bloodline, every kindness, every lingering glance, every pressed wildflower. Built on a foundation of calculation so precise it produced the specific ache of realizing you've been valued for what runs through your veins rather than for who you are. Then I found the second document, behind the genealogy chart, a Greyvale Intercept Order, dated 12 years ago, Frost Hollow Border Sector. Target, any wolf carrying the Rennick surname. Authorization, Dorian Ashwick. 12 years ago, the year my father vanished on a border patrol and no body was recovered. I read it twice. Then a third time. Each reading carved the same truth deeper. My father hadn't disappeared in a territorial dispute. He'd been intercepted by wolves hunting the Sovereign Thread. They'd found a Rennick on patrol. Taken him. And when his blood didn't carry what they wanted, the thread passes through the matriline, not the patriline. They had no reason to return him. His coat still sat in a cedar chest. I'd packed it away because seeing it was a wound. Now I understood the wound had never been grief alone. It had been the unanswered question beneath the grief, pressing upward for 12 years. Dorian Ashwick had answered it. I returned the folio, memorized every detail, and walked out of that archive with 12 years of silence that finally had a name. I didn't confront Dale that day. Information detonates once. The timing had to be surgical. Instead, I threw myself into the next tradition. The boundary walk required each candidate to patrol the territorial perimeter. Nesta completed it in 6 hours, riding horseback for most of the route with guides who knew every trail marker. I went on foot. My father had taught me that you learn a territory by feeling it beneath your boots, not by watching it pass beneath hooves. For the first 3 hours, I moved well, reading the terrain, identifying trail markers, cataloging the boundary stones with the tracker's focus. Then the Western Ridge Trail split at a rockfall that didn't appear on any of the maps I'd studied. I chose left. The trail narrowed, became overgrown, and dead-ended at a cliff face overlooking a river gorge. I lost an hour. Standing at that dead end, with the wind cutting through my coat and the sun already angling low, I pressed my hand against the cliff face. Cold stone, real stone, the kind that doesn't lie or rearrange itself. I let it anchor me, rock steadies everything, by refusing to move. Then I backtracked, found the correct trail, and ran. I ran until my lungs were raw and my legs trembled and the border stones blurred past in the failing light. I identified 2 boundary markers that had shifted since the last survey. Details I almost missed due to the fatigue, but caught because my father's training lived deeper in me than tiredness could. Reach. I finished in 5 hours, 1 hour faster than Nesta on horseback. But I arrived at the keep gates with shaking legs and dirt on my hands and knees, and the border captain who logged my return had to steady my arm as I signed the register. Commander Halslown Vey noted the shifted markers in his official report. He also noted, in a line I wasn't meant to see, that the Frost Hollow candidate completed the walk on foot and identified discrepancies 3 successive patrols had missed. Nesta completed the walk in comfort. I completed it on my knees. The pack noticed the difference. That evening, I found Dale on the eastern terrace. Mountains rose black against a sky just beginning to scatter with early stars. The air tasted like pine resin and approaching snow. "You found the archive," he said. He'd been watching me all day. I'd felt his attention shift from strategic observation to something closer to dread. The thread. My father. The intercept order. Each word landed between us like a stone dropped from height. "You knew what I was before the treaty existed. You knew what happened to my father. And you brought me here without telling me any of it." Silence sat between us. When he spoke, his voice dropped below its usual register, bare and rough. The voice of a man standing between justification and honesty and choosing the harder one. The thread activates through a willing bond, genuinely willing, free of manipulation, free of pressure. If I'd told you about the inheritance before you arrived, every choice you made here would have bent under that knowledge. I needed your decisions to be yours. So you decided to keep me ignorant. For my own freedom. You understand the contradiction. I understand it now. I understood it then too. I told myself the reasoning was sound and ignored that the reasoning served my interests. That was wrong. I won't dress it up. I let his admission settle. Then I pressed into the wound beneath it, the one that had been open for 12 years. My father. The intercept order is 12 years old. I found it 5 months ago when I identified your bloodline. I deployed investigators to Greyvale immediately. They found evidence of a capture, a Frost Hollow wolf held for blood testing. His voice roughened further. The records end there. I don't have answers yet. But I have the order. I have enough evidence for a formal accusation against Dorian, and I have people still searching. I was waiting until you were protected before I moved forward. You were waiting until it was strategically convenient. I was waiting until telling you wouldn't put you in danger from a man who has already demonstrated he'll kidnap wolves and test their blood. You walked into his daughter's contestation 8 days ago. If Dorian knew you'd found that order, he stopped himself. Drew a breath. I'm making excuses. The truth underneath the strategy is simpler. I was afraid. Afraid that if I told you what I'd found about your father, you'd leave. And I didn't want you to leave. That last admission cost him something. I heard it in the texture of his voice. A roughness that had nothing to do with authority, and everything to do with a man who had just handed a woman the exact tool she needed to dismantle him. I need time, I said. Take it. I left him on the terrace. The mountains above us caught the last light, and I walked to the corridors with my father's tracking lessons running beneath my thoughts like groundwater, the knowledge that a trail always continues. Even when you can't see the next marker, even when the path splits at a rockfall and you choose wrong and have to double back. You keep walking. You keep reading the ground. I wasn't finished with Dale Korath, but the next conversation required a version of me that hadn't fully arrived yet. She arrived by morning. I found him in the training yard at dawn. He was alone, working through combat forms with the focused discipline of a man who hadn't slept and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. Tell me about the study, I said. Nesta. That night, All of it. He lowered the practice blade, faced me with the stillness of a man who'd been carrying the truth and waiting for the door to open. She arrived uninvited. Her father arranged it. Dorian positioned Nesta outside my study and sent word through a servant that I had an urgent message from the Ashwick delegation. When I opened the door, she walked in. My sleeves were rolled because I'd been working alone for hours. The wine was mine. The coat was off because the fire was high, and her hand on your shoulder, placed there seconds before you appeared. I heard the hinges. I was reaching to remove it when you stepped through. Every detail you catalogued was either coincidental or staged by Dorian to make you walk away from the treaty voluntarily. When that failed, they initiated the contestation. Why should I believe any of this? Because I've had 10 days to construct a comfortable lie, and instead I'm standing here telling you truths that make you trust me. Less. A man trying to manipulate you would have given you a better story. I held that for a long moment. Then I gave him the final piece. Sable is working for Dorian. He went completely still. The kind of stillness that precedes either violence or extraordinary control. She's been feeding intelligence to Ashwick since before we arrived. The study scene was the first phase, engineered to make me abandon the treaty. When that failed, they pivoted to the contestation. Their endgame involves poisoning the Korath chalice during the final tradition, frostleaf concentrate, mimics altitude sickness and mountain-born wolves. 3 minutes to cardiac arrest. I watched him absorb this. His expression didn't shift into fury. He went quiet. Deliberately, completely quiet. And when he spoke, the first words out of his mouth were not about the conspiracy, the poison, or the threat to his authority. What do you want to do? A man commanding the largest military force in the northern provinces, asking me what I wanted instead of telling me what would happen. That question, that single question, issued without strategy, without performance, without the faintest trace of a king managing a crisis. Just a man standing in the early light, asking a woman what she needed. It rewrote something I hadn't known was still being written. I want to finish this, I said, on my terms. And I need you to understand the logic before you argue with it. I'm listening. If we arrest Sable now, Dorian denies everything. He claims she acted alone. The contestation continues, and he tries again with someone we haven't identified. I need the poison in the chalice, in the hall, in front of 4 delegations and every elder. If 200 wolves watch his agent's plot exposed in real time, Dorian can't deny it, can't spin it. Can't survive it. He studied me for a long moment. You learn strategy from someone good. My father. He used to say the best tracker doesn't chase. She lets the trail come to her. Something moved behind his dark eyes. An acknowledgement that the man whose disappearance he was still investigating had raised the woman standing in front of him, and that the debt between those two truths was one he intended to pay. What do you need from me? Access to the legal texts? Specifically the provisions on ceremonial vessel verification. I need the exact language for invoking an inspection, a meeting with Counselor Marin to present the evidence, and a guarantee that the chalice reaches the hall untouched. Let them poison it. I want the proof where everyone can see it. Marin is the presiding judge. She can't advocate for one candidate. I'm not asking her to advocate. I'm asking her to act as a judicial officer presented with evidence of crimes committed within her jurisdiction. The law requires her to verify. I'll present the intercept order, the archived documents, and the assassination plot. What she does with verified evidence is her legal obligation, not a favor. He exhaled through his nose, a sharp release that nearly became a laugh under different circumstances. Legal texts delivered to your quarters within the hour. I'll arrange the meeting with Marin. The chalice arrives sealed. He paused, dropped the last piece of armor between us. And Tova, I posted myself outside your door the first 3 nights of the contestation. Not because I doubted your strength. Because I couldn't sleep knowing you were 30 feet away, believing I'd betrayed you, and I had no right to knock. I know, I said. I heard you breathing through the door. Morning light on the training yard. His dark eyes on mine. and a silence that, for the first time, carried no distance, only the shared recognition of two people who had finally told each other everything and were still standing. The Ember trial tested physical endurance through mountain forest. The morning of the trial, I found the training stairs slicked with oil, subtle enough to resemble condensation. Exactly the accident Sable had described. I took the side entrance. The trail through Embervane's mountain forest was steep, technical, and punishing. My legs hadn't fully recovered from the boundary walk 2 days earlier. The dead-end detour and the desperate run home had taken more than I'd admitted. By the halfway point, my thighs were shaking and my lungs worked harder than they should have at this altitude. I pushed through it. Mountain wolves don't stop when the body protests. We stop when the mountain says stop, and even then we argue. I crossed the finish line with the fastest time in 17 years. Then I bent double with my hands on my knees and breathed until the black spots cleared from the edges of my vision. Nesta finished 20 minutes behind, winded and incandescent with fury. A young wolf from the training yard brought me water. "You run like something's chasing you," he said. "Something is," I told him. "I'm just faster." He laughed. I drank the water. And I noticed, at the edge of the crowd, Dale watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Pride, yes, but threaded through it, the raw and unguarded look of a man watching someone earn in real time what he'd only ever inherited. The final proving tradition took place on the 10th night. The great hall blazed with every brazier lit. Tables cleared for an open center where both candidates would face the assembled pack. 4 allied delegations filled the upper tiers. Councillor Maren presided from a raised bench. At the head of the hall, on a platform of carved black stone, sat the Korath throne. Iron forged 4 centuries ago by the first Alpha King, veined with the same raw ore that threaded the keep's walls. On its arm rested the Korath crown, a circlet of iron and ember stone that every Luna in Embervane's history had worn during the bonding ceremony. Nesta wore crimson. I wore white. In Frost Hollow, white is the color of unguarded truth, what you wear when you have nothing to hide and nothing to prove. I wanted to stand before that hall with nothing hidden. The final tradition, the declaration, required each candidate to state her claim, then drink from the Korath chalice to seal commitment. Nesta spoke first. Polished. Eloquent. She described Dale as a strategic asset to be optimized rather than a person to stand beside. She spoke about bloodlines, alliances, territorial advantage. She never once mentioned the pack's families, the village, or a single wolf by name. She could have been describing a merger between 2 trading companies. Maren turned to me. "Tova Rennick, your declaration." I walked to the center. Faced 200 wolves. I came to Emberven as a transaction, a body traded for border protection. I accepted it because 86 families needed to survive, and my freedom was a reasonable price. Absolute stillness. In 16 days, I've been deceived about the true purpose of my presence here. I've discovered my bloodline carries an inheritance I was deliberately kept ignorant of. I've learned that the father I lost 12 years ago was taken by wolves hunting that inheritance. Wolves who sit in this hall tonight. Something shifted behind Dorian Ashwick's granite expression. Barely visible, but 200 wolves saw it. And I've learned that my closest friend, a woman who braided my hair on the morning we left home, who held my hand during the journey south, who pressed her forehead against mine on the mornings when grief made it hard to breathe, has been conspiring with an enemy Alpha to manipulate this contestation, and failing that, to end my life. Sable went rigid in the 4th row. The color left her face in stages, like watching a tide withdraw from a shore it would never return to. Before I drink from the chalice, I invoke the right of inquiry. Any candidate may request independent verification of ceremonial vessels before consumption. Councillor Maren, I'd like the pack healer to examine the chalice. Maren's expression didn't shift. I had presented her with the intercept order, the archived documents, and the evidence of the assassination plot that morning. She hadn't helped me as a candidate. She had acted as a judicial officer presented with evidence of crimes committed within her jurisdiction. The law required her to verify. She verified. She nodded to old Yoldi, the pack healer, a woman whose hands had delivered more wolves into the world than anyone could count. Yoldi took the chalice from the ceremonial table, dipped a weathered finger, touched it to her tongue. Her face collapsed. Frostleaf concentrate, lethal within 3 minutes, mimics altitude sickness in mountain-born wolves. The hall erupted. Wolves surged upright, voices crashed against stone. Dale's presence expanded. Gravitational, an alpha whose fury had passed beyond heat into a cold that bent the air around him. Who prepared the chalice? His voice leveled the room to silence. The steward stepped forward, pale and trembling. A woman from the Frost Hollow delegation requested kitchen access this morning. She claimed the candidate asked her to add a blessing herb from their home pack. The full hall turned toward Sable. She stood, held herself together for 2 seconds. Then the mask fell and I saw the woman underneath, panicked, cornered, her eyes darting toward exits that were already blocked. The calculating operative from the storehouse was gone. In her place stood a frightened girl trapped in a situation she'd lost control of long before this night. "You don't understand the stakes," she said. Her voice shook. "The sovereign thread changes everything. If it activates in the wrong hands, Dorian Ashwick." Marin's voice cut the air. "Rise." He rose from the eastern bench, massive, unyielding. A man who had built his power on the assumption that size and certainty were the same thing. Your daughter invoked a false contestation. Your agent attempted assassination within Allied walls. Your objective was suppression of a matrilineal inheritance threatening your territorial control. 12 years ago, your forces intercepted a Frost Hollow border wolf named Heron Rennick under a capture order bearing your personal authorization. Marin held up the document I'd found in the archive, verified by 3 independent elders that morning. "Do you deny any of this?" "I deny nothing." Dorian's voice filled the chamber with the confidence of a man who had never been held accountable and expected the pattern to continue. The thread in uncontrolled hands represents an existential threat to every pack in the northern provinces. I acted in defense of my territory. Any alpha in this room would have done the same. "Any alpha in this room," Marin replied, "would be subject to the same law you now face. The Iron Charter's hospitality provisions. Summit peace codes, prohibition against assassination within Allied walls, and the kidnapping and presumed murder of a protected pack member. This council finds cause for immediate expulsion, severance of all alliance agreements, and formal charges before the Summit Tribunal." Nesta stood beside her father. Her face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Defiance, recalculation, and finally the blank shock of a woman realizing the room she'd always owned had changed its locks. She looked at Dale. "You chose her. She chose herself," Dale answered. "I'm fortunate enough to be standing nearby." Guards escorted the Greyvale delegation toward the doors. Dorian walked with the rigid posture of a man who had finally discovered that the world contained consequences. Nesta followed, silent, diminished, already receding into a future that looked nothing like the one she'd planned. Sable walked with them, head down, shoulders curved, moving through the hall like someone walking underwater. At the door, she stopped, turned. Her eyes found mine across the distance. What passed between us belonged to no single word. 12 years. And the knowledge that the man who took my father had turned my closest friend into his instrument. I held her gaze until the guards moved her through the doors, steadily, without rage, because rage would have been easy and what I felt was harder. The doors closed. The hall settled. Marin turned to me. "The contestation is resolved. Tova Rennick stands as sole Luna candidate. Do you accept the title?" "No." Silence so complete, I heard the braziers breathing. I turned from Marin, walked toward the raised platform. 200 wolves watched me climb the 3 stone steps to where the Korath throne sat, black iron, scarred by 4 centuries of rule. The Korath crown rested on its arm, emberstone catching the firelight like a trapped sun. I placed my hands on the iron. The sovereign thread had been rising for days. A whisper during the boundary walk when my legs had nothing left and something deeper than muscle kept me upright. A hum during the Ember trial when I'd crossed the finish line and sensed, beneath my hammering heartbeat, a second pulse that wasn't mine. A tremor during Dorian's confrontation when I'd stood before 200 wolves and felt every bond in the room pressing against my awareness like voices heard through a wall. Now, with my palms flat against 4 centuries of iron, it arrived completely. It didn't arrive because I'd bonded with Dale. I hadn't chosen him yet. The thread had woken because of every bond I'd built in this keep over 16 days. The cook who told me about the supply routes, the border captain's mate who showed me her daughter's healing leg, the young wolf who'd brought me water after the Ember trial, the wolves who'd watched me finish the boundary walk on shaking legs and decided on their own that I belonged among them. The thread didn't need a king, it needed a pack. And somewhere in 16 days of listening and asking and caring about people who weren't mine yet, they'd become mine. I didn't command it. I released it, like opening a fist you didn't realize you'd been clenching your entire life. The iron heated beneath my hands. The throne began to glow along its seams, the same way the keep's walls glowed with raw ore, as though the metal remembered the mountain it came from and the fire that shaped it. The glow deepened, the heat intensified, and then silver-white flame climbed the iron bones of the throne, consuming the crown on its arm, turning emberstone to ash and iron to slag. 200 wolves watched me burn a throne. Not a single one tried to stop me. The fire lasted 90 seconds. I stood beside it with my hands at my sides while the flames reflected in every pair of eyes in the hall. When it died, a pile of blackened iron and pale ash sat on the carved stone platform where power had been inherited, never chosen, for 400 years. I turned to face the hall. My voice carried the way mountain wind carries clear cold, reaching every corner without raising itself. I don't accept the title as it was offered, through treaty, through transaction, through an arrangement that treated me as a strategic resource to be acquired. That seat was built for women who were chosen by someone else's calculation. It was never mine. I looked at the smoking remains. And now it's no one's. Then, and this was the moment the thread stopped being an inheritance I bore and became something I understood, I reached into the web of bonds. I saw the hull clearly for the first time. Every connection between every wolf, loyalty, devotion, duty, fear, trust, resentment, love, luminous threads spanning the distance between bodies like a living constellation. Dale's bonds radiated outward in deep-rooted lines, earned through genuine service and real sacrifice. The gaps where Dorian's severed connections had been were already closing, the pack healing around the wound like tissue around a splinter finally removed. And Sable? Even through the closed doors, I could sense her. The bond between us still existed, dimmed, damaged, but present. And to the thread, I could read what I hadn't been able to see with my eyes alone. The earliest strands of our bond were clean, bright, real. The girl who showed up at my cabin every morning at 11, who braided my hair while I grieved, she had been genuine. The corruption came later, wound around the original bond like wire around a living branch, and wound tightest of all, a dark cord of coercion linking her to Dorian. I could read its texture, made of threats and leverage, the work of a powerful man who finds a vulnerable woman and offers her a choice that looks like a choice but carries a knife behind it. I reached for that cord, and I severed it. Not violently, precisely. A surgeon's cut, clean removal of something that doesn't belong in a living body. Beyond the doors, Sable's reaction reached me through the thread, before any sound could have, a sharp intake, a sudden absence of the dark cord, and then something I hadn't expected. Relief. A flood of it. The sensation of a woman surfacing from deep water and remembering what air tasted like. 200 wolves sensed the severance. Pressure dropping, the air clearing, the indefinable recognition that something rotten had been excised from the room. They understood instinctively what had happened. Their Luna had used powers she'd never asked for to free a woman who had tried to kill her. I could have used the thread to compel, to dominate, to reshape every bond in the room according to my will. Instead, I'd used it to liberate. The pack understood the difference. I saw it in the web, 100 luminous threads brightening at once like stars emerging after clouds break. I turned to Dale. He stood at the edge of the platform, his dark eyes holding a vulnerability he had never shown before his pack. The strategist, the king. And beneath both, visible for the first time in this hall, the man. All three, waiting for a verdict he couldn't influence and wouldn't try to. "But I will stand beside you," I said, "because you posted yourself outside my door for 3 nights after the contestation began, thinking I didn't know. Because you sent someone to the mountains to find a wildflower I mentioned once in a conversation you had no reason to remember. Because when I told you I had been handling an assassination plot alone, your first response was to ask me what I wanted. And because when I asked you hard questions on a dark terrace, you answered with truths that cost you instead of lies that would have served you." His composure broke, the only time I would ever see it happen. A tightening of his throat, a brightness in his eyes that had never been shown to these wolves before. The sheen of a man who had carried authority his entire life and had never once been chosen by someone who didn't have to choose him. "I choose you, Dale Korath, freely, without obligation, without the treaty, without the thread, and without any force in this world compelling me. Just my voice in this hall saying, 'I choose you.'" He stepped down from the platform's edge, crossed the distance between us, and in front of elders, commanders, and witnesses who would remember this night for generations, Alpha King Dale Korath lowered himself to one knee. "I kneel to no title," he said, his voice rough and bare. "I kneel to Tova Rennick, who arrived with one bag and a borrowed dress and more integrity than this, keep his scene in 4 centuries, who dismantled every lie I built and still chose to stand in front of me. If you'll have me, as a man earning the choice you just made every day, starting now, then I am yours." Counselor Marin rose first. With the deliberate gravity of 6 decades of authority, she lowered herself to one knee. Then the front row. Then the second. The thread hummed in my chest. I held it still. This had to be theirs. Row by row, 200 wolves knelt. The sound of it. Leather and iron and shifting weight, a pack lowering itself like a tide, responding to a moon it had just recognized, filled the hall with something older than music. They were kneeling because they had watched a woman from a frozen mountain walk through deception, betrayal, assassination, and the destruction of a 400-year throne and emerge holding nothing but her own choices. They decided, freely, that she was worth following. I took Dale's hand, pulled him to his feet. "Stand up. You kneel to no one. One exception." His hand tightened around mine. "One person. For the rest of my life." When he kissed me, the sovereign thread settled into my bloodstream like a river finding its ancient course. 41 generations of women who understood that real authority is the unshakable knowledge of your own worth. Held so firmly the world reorganizes around it. The wolves of Emberven rose to their feet, and the sound they made, a resonance that came from the chest and moved through stone, older than howling, older than language, shook ash from the platform where a throne had burned. Dorian's coalition fractured within a month. Faced with formal charges before the Summit Tribunal and abandoned by allies who wanted no part of what had been exposed in that hall, 4 of his vassal packs petitioned to join Embervine voluntarily. The Greyvale faction retreated behind its borders to await a judgment Dorian could no longer buy his way out of. The Stoneridge faction withdrew its territorial claims against Frost Hollow within a week, quietly, without ceremony, because border disputes resolve themselves when the pack on the other side announces a Luna who can perceive the architecture of loyalty itself. Frost Hollow's borders received permanent military reinforcement. Brenna Hale sent a message that read, in its entirety, "They got more than they bargained for. Your mother says to eat more." The the same words Sable had used the night before we left Frost Hollow. Brenna meant them differently. I held both versions and let them mean what they meant. Sable sent a letter 6 weeks later. I read it alone in the garden under a sky wide enough to hold everything I felt. She wrote that the recruitment had come 6 years ago. She'd been 17 when Dorian's agents found her through her connection to me, and the choice they'd offered had come wrapped in threats against her own family that she'd believed, because she'd already seen what Dorian did to people who refused him. She wrote about the moment the coercion severed, how she'd fallen to her knees outside the Great Hall and heard, for the first time in 6 years, what her own thoughts sounded like without Dorian's voice underneath them. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked if, someday, she could explain. I wrote back 3 words, "When you're ready." Every bridge can't be rebuilt, but some can be walked toward from both sides, one honest step at a time. My mother arrived 3 weeks after the ceremony, surveyed the iron chandeliers and vaulted ceilings of the rebuilt Luna's Hall. A new space, designed together, no throne, just a long table and an open hearth, and said, "Very dramatic. We'll need curtains." She brought my father's patrol coat. I didn't hang it in a closet this time. I hung it in the corridor outside our quarters where every wolf who passed would see it. My father walked a border patrol 12 years ago, and a man who feared what ran through our blood made sure he never came home. I didn't have all the answers yet. The trail didn't end at an intercept order, but I had the resources of the largest pack in the northern provinces. I had a king who had looked me in the eye and said, "I don't have answers, but I'll find them." And I had what my father left me, a tracker's patience, a hunter's stillness, and the knowledge that you never stop following a trail until it reaches its end. Some debts take time to collect. I was patient. He was Alpha by birth. I became Luna by fire. The moments that define us are never the ones where we hold power. They're the ones where everything is stripped away, the throne, the title, the lies dressed as protection, and we discover what remains when the iron melts and the ash settles. Not the title, not the bloodline, the irreducible truth of who you are when the room empties, the silence falls, and the only voice left is yours. I was a girl from a frozen mountain with a dead father's coat and a best friend turned weapon. I walked into a king's fortress as a line in a treaty. I burned his throne and built something that couldn't be inherited, only chosen. Some love is negotiation. Some love is a cage dressed in diplomacy. But the love worth burning everything to reach begins the moment you stop performing and start choosing. Would you have stayed? Would you have trusted again? Or would you have walked through those gates and never looked back? Tell me. I want to know. If this story stayed with you, you belong here at Destined Hearts. Every story we tell is a door, and the woman on the other side is always worth believing in. Subscribe. I'll meet you in the next one. It's already waiting.